Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagoshnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. He is a blogger and podcaster for many things, including for Cold Omaha, and writes for the Daily Norseman. Please welcome Arif Assad. Arif, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I am fantastic. I haven't been on the show in a while. Oh, you're a useful human, aren't you?
Yeah, you forgot that part of the title, man.
Useful human. I'm not on very often during the summer, and so I'm a little rusty. I've been paying attention, but just letting you and Dusty do your thing, and occasionally letting Dusty go to a concert at Red Rocks because he's a miserable bastard.
Yeah, because he ducked out and abandoned us.
Mm-hmm. Abandoned, like a child at a fire department drop-in. What a prick. So, welcome to this week's show. We have a special guest to get to in just a moment as well, but before we do, if you would like to donate to Norse Code, you can do so in a number of different places. If you find value in what you're hearing, you can donate to us at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and be a sustaining member, which is like a monthly thing. You can do anything. I believe it's up to $1 million, which would be awesome. But if you just want to toss $350 our way, we'd really appreciate it. It does help keep the lights on. And we have a new person who has donated, Alex Goebel. I'm assuming it's Goebel and not Gobble, who has donated through Patreon. And he says, quote, "Half of my patronage is because I really like the podcast. The other half is for Arif putting up with me, pestering him on Twitter without exercising his blocking rights. Keep up the good work, guys."
All right, yeah. That literally takes no effort from me at all, probably. So I'm glad I
absolutely
received
no effort.
Your patronage as a result, or rather, we received, because it mostly just goes to the show.
It does go to the show. Helps with storage costs. Helps with microphone stuff. So we truly do appreciate it. And it turns out all you need to do to keep Arif from blocking you is just donate to the show. I feel like this sets a good precedent.
It does, but it also might set a bad precedent.
Well, we can ignore that for a little bit until it becomes a problem and still take money anyway. I feel like that'll be okay. We do have a special guest to bring on. We are welcoming in from Minnesota Vikings Corner, MNVikingsCorner.com, Daniel House. Daniel, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing tonight?
We are doing quite well, and we want to point out this is MNVikingsCorner.com, although the Twitter handle is at Vikings Corner.
Yeah, otherwise you'll go to like a really out-of-date blog if you just go to VikingsCorner.com.
If you want hot takes about Jimmy Clausen, that's where to go, VikingsCorner.com.
I think you mean great takes about Jimmy Clausen.
They are hot takes.
That's the second page of the of VikingsCorner.com has this great list of potential prospects for teams, and I think all but 2 of them are out of the league now. Things like should the Vikings pick up Tebow and Clausen and all that, so
it's good stuff.
It's fantastic stuff. Although we were joking that if Arif had been writing 6 years ago, that we would see similar takes, but Arif contends that he wasn't writing 6 years ago.
Well, I wasn't writing about football 6 years ago, and certainly I wasn't writing for internet consumption. I wouldn't let you savages have that.
But we have a couple of things to talk about as far as the news goes. We are entering the May news drought, the time of year when it's actually a good thing that your team doesn't make the headlines, because usually that means somebody got arrested.
Right.
So we've entered that portion of the preseason, and it's good to note that no one's been arrested so far. But it does mean that when Adrian Peterson says something stupid, that it immediately becomes news. So Adrian Peterson did a nice little team statement talking about how he's really hopeful about the team and how Teddy Bridgewater really reminds him of Tom Brady. And as a result, that's all that anyone took from that whole thing. Not, hey, we're really excited about this year, our defense is really good and everything. No, it's so he thinks that Bridgewater is Brady.
Yeah, no, that's obviously what he was saying. So there's actually a couple of things from this story that are kind of amusing, and they kind of dovetail together. So like one of them, of course, is that he was like, yeah, so Teddy's playing style is very similar to Brady's playing style, and I think that they can win in the same way. It's functionally what he's saying, right? And he talks about like short and mid-range passes, but he says he's good at those mediocre passes. At which point there are a bunch of. I didn't know about this until I actually did a radio spot, and the host brought this up. But there's a bunch of Patriots fans who were really offended because they thought he called Tom Brady mediocre instead of like. So Adrian Peterson is not a wordsmith, and maybe he just used the wrong word.
Well, I think it was taken a little bit out of context a little bit too. I mean, he really wasn't saying that Tom Brady and Teddy Bridgewater were the same quarterback. I mean, I think
that's all people took from it. Yeah.
That's all people are spinning it to be, is that Adrian indicated that Teddy was Tom Brady when he was just saying, relatively speaking, they're similar in the way they throw the mediocre passes.
The mediocre passes thing is so funny to me. Because I mean, he
sounds childish.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident he just meant intermediate. Like I'm very confident. I'm not just pretty confident. I'm very confident he meant to say intermediate, and then like used the wrong word because he's Adrian Peterson. Like he's not like a Nobel laureate author or anything like that. He just used. I mean, and he's used the wrong word before. He's put his foot in his mouth before. More often now, it seems like than back in like 2008.
Well, he's getting older. He's what, 30 now?
He's senile, basically.
You can't expect that sort of clarity. You might have expected that at 21 right out of the draft, but he's pushing 30, man. This is one of the main reasons people talk about getting rid of 30-year-old running backs.
Oh yeah, he's hitting the threshold. He is.
But yeah, so there's that, and then like I think that if you strip away the fact that Adrian Peterson said it and he said the wrong word, and like it's like a sin to compare people to good people, or whatever, he's right that like Bridgewater's playing style is very similar to Tom Brady's playing style, especially more contemporary Tom Brady. Maybe not 2007 Tom Brady, but like 2004 and 2015 Tom Brady. Their playing style is very similar in terms of like how they attack the field, how they tend to prefer short and mid-range passes, specifically how they like to hit those crossers a lot. Like there's a big thing about the Patriots offense and the Vikings offense. They do handle pressure a little bit differently. But they're both very good at responding to pressure, and some people even made that stylistic comparison coming out of the draft. That hey, Teddy Bridgewater stylistically is like maybe like Tom Brady or something like that. It was difficult to come up with a stylistic comparison because he's good at scrambling, but he's not an athlete, and so there's not a ton of quarterbacks that fit that mold. But for the most part, yeah, it's not a bad comparison.
No, I don't think it is either.
When Teddy overthrows his receiver, it does look like a Tom Brady overthrowing.
Very reminiscent of Tom Brady.
It does remind me of Tom Brady's overthrows when it's like 10 or 15 yards ahead of Wallace.
I think that's it for that story.
I really, the only other thing you could mention is that Skip Bayless was on first take. Yeah, first take.
Yep.
And he didn't go completely crazy and actually said a few nice things about the Vikings. The whole clip is on the Daily Norseman if you'd like to take a listen or watch. But when Skip Bayless is the calm, rational voice in the room, you have a problem with the program, and that's all that was there. Shannon Sharp was going crazy about something, and Skip Bayless was the calm hand guiding the ship. Like, really? That's where we're at? Ugh. But there's one other piece of news worth mentioning, and that seems to be that many people seem to think we're only going to win 9 games this year, Arif.
Yeah, Danny, I don't know if you've seen this, but like a bunch of websites specifically have chosen 9 games. So Football Outsiders writing for ESPN Insider, has them at 9 games. I know Mike Clay, formerly of Pro Football Focus, now I forget where he's at. He might be writing for a fantasy website. He also has the Vikings at like 9 games. Vegas has the Vikings at 9 games. And I understand that the division got better, right? And that the Vikings schedule's a little bit tougher than it was last year. But that does seem a little unusual to you, right, Daniel?
Yeah, I would say that seems a little unusual. I mean, I think 10 games is a realistic number if you're going to drop down, just a little bit. But I mean, the schedule is pretty difficult this season. I mean, there's a couple tough matchups, and it will be interesting to see when you have some lulls in the schedule where there's a lot of primetime games and not a lot of rest in between, how that works out too. I think that is kind of the tricky aspect of the schedule when you kind of analyze it from afar.
Yeah, I would be impressed if some of these websites did take that into account because, it increases the likelihood of losses. I know that a bunch of basketball statistics organizations, when they project records, will often take into account back-to-backs and stuff like that when they try to predict records for teams and stuff. But my guess is a lot of these, which is not to say that they don't do very good in-depth analysis, but I mean, it doesn't tend to go all the way granular to like the level of like, well, they've got a 4-day week here. They've got I think there's 2 Thursday night games in a row, which is weird, even though there's a week of rest, right? Like there's Thanksgiving and then there's a Thursday night game or something like that on the schedule. And then, they've got a couple of weird spots in the schedule. I think they've got a bunch of road games at one point. And if they took that into account, I'd be pretty impressed, but I kind of doubt it. I think some of it is that they project the Lions to be a lot better, like a lot of these teams do. Mm-hmm. And I get it. Like, I get that, why the Lions are probably better than the record last year, but they did lose Calvin Johnson. And so, because I remember this is a thing that Mike Clay talked about. The Vikings weren't very good at touchdown production, and I get that because, they weren't. But the Vikings also produced more points per drive than the Lions did. And it's because they were better at getting into scoring position and kicking field goals, and I doubt Blair Walsh gets any worse than he was last year. He's the worst year of his career was last year. So I doubt he gets any worse. And so I just feel like Lions touchdown production is a bad argument with Calvin Johnson gone.
Yeah, and Clay was also arguing that, the Lions scored a lot more points than the Vikings last year and more efficient on offense. And I mean, I just don't think that's comparing apples to apples when you look at the Vikings defense. I mean, the Vikings have a way better defense. To me, that's more important.
Yeah, they do, and it's interesting because I just feel like the defense is good enough. Like, if we assume that the defense is 50% and the offense is 50%, which I guess statistically that's not quite true. The offense is better at predicting wins than the defense is, at least the past couple of years in the NFL. But I think it's logical. Like, if we say the defense is worth 50%, I wouldn't be surprised if the defense was good enough with an average offense to win, 6 or 7 games, right? And so then the question is the offense below average by enough that they can only win, 2 games, whatever, right? However you want to break it down. And I think that that's not the case. And I think that, maybe you don't assume that Teddy Bridgewater advances. And not every second-year quarterback who shows promise gets better. That's just true. Sometimes your quarterback plateaus. So maybe they assume that he plateaus for whatever reason. And maybe, they have a low opinion of Quan Treadwell. And maybe they think Adrian Peterson is declining. The offense wasn't bad last year. It was bad against Seattle, but it was Seattle. And it produced a pretty good points per drive average. And Teddy Bridgewater's yards per attempt, which is the most predictive stat when it comes to, quarterbacks projecting wins, was average. I mean, people don't realize that his 7.1, I think it was, yards per attempt was league average in his second year.
I mean, I've been taking a lot of time to watch some of these games back from last year, and what you really see is the red zone was the real weakness on this offense. For sure. Red zone efficiency was pretty poor. I think it was in the bottom half of the league, if I recall. And, some of these balls that Teddy threw down, contested grabs towards the end zone, I think Laquan can really improve that area because there's a lot of balls he threw up to Diggs and Jarius Wright that just they couldn't come down with. That's an area where I think Laquan can kind of help improve that red zone offense because I think that's the one weakness on this offense right now is the red zone.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think Laquan produces something there. If David Morgan gets on the field, I think that he can produce something there. Because, I mean, that dude is slow as balls. But he's got really great hands.
Very versatile as well. He can play, he can line up a lot of different places in the field, too.
Right, yeah. I mean, he lined up completely out wide at UTSA. He lined up in line. He lined up on the numbers. He lined up, anywhere on the line of scrimmage and off the line of scrimmage at times as a flanker. So, yeah, he can line up anywhere, and that can help. I understand if people wouldn't be confident in Michael Pruitt being, a red zone threat, given that he's kind of smaller for a tight end. But, I think it's worth kind of having a little bit of faith in him or Kyle Rudolph. But there's another thing just in general. When you take a step back from the specific players that may help or hurt, red zone offense, red zone efficiency is maybe, from a statistical perspective, one of the least stable statistics from year to year. I don't think people remember. Christian Ponder led the league, I think after 2011, led the league in red zone efficiency. So I would dial down any criticisms of the Vikings offense from that perspective, if it's like from a touchdown scoring perspective.
Yes.
Because the Vikings, if your argument was about like yards per play or drive success rate or something, I think that holds a lot more water. But if it's about touchdowns, it's highly dependent on red zone efficiency. And I just think that even if none of the players get better, and I think that you're right, that Treadwell will do a lot in terms of red zone efficiency, but if none of the players get better, if Treadwell turns out to be as good as Michael Thomas in the red zone last year, the Vikings offense should still be better from a red zone efficiency perspective, because the only way people are regressing the Vikings to the mean is down, which is not how regression to the mean works. They should regress upwards to the mean in terms of red zone efficiency, and that would increase how good the offense is. I mean, the number of kicks inside, and you said they were a below average red zone offense. I think they were well below average. If I remember, I think numerically they were, or statistically they were, in the bottom fourth or something like that. I mean, they were a bad red zone offense. So they should probably regress upwards. And if they do, even if they regress downwards offensively in some other areas, which I kind of doubt, and I sound like a homer, but I kind of doubt it, then their offense should just get better without Teddy having to be a better quarterback, which I think that you and I both kind of reasonably think that he'll probably be a better quarterback too.
Yeah, the Vikings are the sixth worst team in red zone efficiency last season. So yeah, that's your number.
So definitely in the bottom fourth. So yeah, that was pretty bad. But yeah, so 9 wins is kind of weird. A lot of people who have been talking about the Vikings too, and which is not to say everybody is predicting 9 wins. I think Ben Gessling predicted 11 wins. I know Care 11 predicted 13 wins, which why not? Right. But a lot of these websites are just like, this Vikings defense is good. It's a top 5 defense. It's a top 3 defense, whatever. And the fact that the Broncos defense kind of got gutted in free agency and stuff like that does provide another opportunity for a team like the Vikings to sort of move up in the defensive rankings without having to improve. But a lot of these websites statistically like the Vikings defense a lot, and they think it'll get better. And so to argue that the offense will regress to the mean somehow in a bad way, even though they should regress to the mean in a positive way, without the defense regressing to the mean, seems maybe, I don't want to say intellectually dishonest, but maybe not taking into account the full picture.
Well, let's take a look at something real quick. Our big discussion is for this week's episode is going to be team building.
Right.
And we could actually start talking about different ways teams can be constructed. And let's start off with Daniel. What do you think about Teddy Bridgewater and how he has progressed so far?
I'm of the opinion I'm a pretty optimistic guy about Teddy Bridgewater moving forward. I think he's got some work to do just mechanics wise. I think he was a little bit inconsistent mechanically last season, but I think investing enough money in the offensive line like the Vikings did was a good idea. He's got some people up front in front of him. I think that's huge. They brought Laquan in. I think the big key this season is going to be how Teddy plays, because this offense has made a lot of improvements in other areas. The defense, as we discussed, has improved. I think seeing Teddy take the next step and become more consistent is probably the most important aspect of this team for this next season, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right, and I think that it's interesting because a lot of times when we talk about Teddy Bridgewater improving, a lot of people talk about things that are not really in his control, like Laquan Treadwell, which will improve his statistics for sure, but that doesn't necessarily make him a better quarterback. And I agree with you that in addition to having better support, not just from having Treadwell instead of Wallace, but also from having probably a better offensive line, like, fingers crossed, good chance of a better offensive line, maybe I should say that. He'll also improve as a quarterback. So there's reasons that he'll improve statistically that are outside of his control, and then reasons I think that he'll improve. Like, for example, Teddy's only a month and a half older than Carson Wentz. Just got drafted, right? Teddy's 23, and he's not going to turn 24 until the very end of the season. And a lot of times, and I think there's been some statistical work on this. Maybe, I'll try to link it, see if I can find it. But a lot of times it seems like your quarterback story, your trajectory is kind of baked in the cake when you're 26, which is still really young, and that seems maybe too young to me, but we do see this happen a lot in the NFL. Like, if you don't produce at least one good season by the time you're 26, then you're probably bad. You could argue statistically Teddy's rookie year was better than this year statistically, depending on which ones you look at. But for sure, Teddy not only has more time to put together a stellar season, but he's already put together a pretty good season. And I think both seasons were pretty good. But I think that if you cared a lot about touchdown numbers, which we just talked about, then yeah, his rookie season was fine. So there's a good chance that just because of his, not looking at anything else, there's a good chance that just because of his age, he'll probably improve as a quarterback. Now, if you take that away, I think the fact that he's shown growth, I think in a lot of areas over the course of a year, is good evidence. I think that he's done a better job responding to pressure, which sucks because then in his second year he received more pressure. So the fact that he got better at responding to pressure didn't produce better results because he was just under it more often. But I thought that he did a better job under pressure. And I thought his rookie year he did a fantastic job under pressure. I think that he does a better job of taking chances on the outside. Still has to improve at taking chances in general. He has to be a more aggressive quarterback. But I thought he did a better job of that. And then I thought, I think you're right. Mechanically, he seems to have regressed. And I think that he can improve. I thought his mechanics at Louisville were better than his mechanics this last year.
His throwing motion particularly stands out to me. It's very inconsistent.
Yeah, inconsistent's a good word because I think that from game to game, there's not necessarily a single. Maybe there is, but there isn't like a markedly awful throwing motion. It's not like he's Kevin Hogan or Phillip Rivers in any particular game, but they've changed from game to game, and that's affected his ball placement and accuracy.
The best game I seen Teddy, throwing motion, mechanics, everything, was the Arizona game last year. That was the best game Teddy played, in my opinion.
He played a pretty phenomenal game against Arizona. I had a couple of decision-making questions I had for Teddy, especially sort of near the end of the game, but I think mechanically you're right. And then overall his decision-making was actually very, very good, so that would just be nitpicking for my part. I want to say mechanically his best game was actually his rookie year against Miami. I thought he did a phenomenal job.
Yes.
Quick release, good ball level, good ball placement. As a result, he stepped into almost all of his throws. He was able to throw on the run with solid mechanics. And stuff like that. But yeah, no, I think you're right. And that's one of the issues, that we can identify games that stand out to us mechanically for Teddy, which means that there are some games where he doesn't. And I think maybe it was Phil Simms, whose commentary I'm not a huge fan of all the time, but he did a good job pointing out at some point, Teddy's elbow drop in one of the games, which was a consistent feature of his passing in that particular game. Led to ball placement and actually arm strength concerns, because when his mechanics change, he loses a little bit of velocity on the ball, and he has less wiggle room than a lot of other quarterbacks. And I don't even think he's got a weak arm. I think a lot of people think that, and I think his arm is he's better than Ponders. I think it's a fine arm. But one of the reasons people think that he has a weak arm, I think, is, and it's fair, is because of those inconsistent mechanics.
Just a fine arm.
Yeah.
A fine arm.
Well, it's inconsistency is what you're exactly right. It's just one game it looks very, very good. The other game it kind of looks meh, and then it never gets really below meh. It's just it's never poor in my opinion. It's just inconsistent.
Yeah, and I think the inconsistency is more damaging than if he had kept like the mechanics from. I'm trying to remember a game. Did they play the Giants last year?
Yes.
Yeah, I think if I'm remembering correctly, his mechanics either that or I'm just like remembering the Josh Freeman game way wrong. But
No, that's the nightmare. You've taken that was the Chantix fueled nightmare game. That's all that was.
I'm glad I had a middle school band, a high school band concert that night. And I missed the first half of that game, so I was very thankful for that.
But yeah, if he kept the mechanics, and I mean the Vikings won like 49 to like 10 or 49 to 17 or something like that. So it's not like you could be like, Teddy sucked it up that game. But if he just kept the mechanics from a relatively mechanically poor game like that all year, I don't think I'd have as much of a concern because he could get used to his mechanics and place the ball well and have reasonable arm strength and whatever. But I think that if your mechanics are inconsistent, your throws are more inconsistent. And Teddy was super accurate. I think like Pro Football Focus had him as the most accurate quarterback in the NFL. If you look at it not from like a did it hit the receiver's hands perspective, but like from a ball placement perspective, he was fine. But if you can make someone who's generally pretty accurate much more accurate, you're in a really good spot. And I think that his accuracy and his arm strength suffered not just because of poor mechanics or anything like that, but because of inconsistent mechanics, and his ball just didn't get to fly with as much velocity as usual, or as much like I want to like give an inanimate object like a personality. I want to say like the ball flew with more decisiveness or whatever. But that is kind of what it feels like, is your mechanics are inconsistent. When you throw the ball and your mechanics change, the ball feels like it's coming out hesitantly, which is a weird thing to say, but it does affect like the velocity and the accuracy of the ball much more than just having poor mechanics does.
Yeah.
Well, and he really opens up a ton in his throwing motion. When his arm starts dipping, he really opens up a lot, I notice.
Yeah, and it opens up at the wrong spot because, I don't think there's a problem. Yeah, I don't think there's a problem necessarily with opening up so much as you're like rotating, your shoulder through or anything like that. If you rotate your shoulder through and you open up early in the motion, that's fine. But if you're opening up late in the motion, and that causes some problems.
Well, let's talk about another philosophy thing here. Obviously, we have training camp coming up here soon. Will they end up carrying 2 quarterbacks or 3 going into the season? Which would you prefer? Daniel?
Yeah, what do you think, Daniel? Yeah.
I'm a 3 quarterback guy. I don't think Sean Hill is going anywhere. I think if he was going to be gone, he would have been gone a long time ago. I think, Heineke's not probably ready to be the 2 yet. I think it'll be the same quarterback structure that took place last season.
And because of what you said about Heineke, and I think you're a fan of him, I'm a fan of him too, but because of what you said about Heineke, you think that they should carry 3, not only that they will, but that they should.
I think that they should, because he needs just probably 1 more year to get familiarized and to make sure that he is a guy that can be competent in the event Teddy gets hurt.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I would prefer 2, and I think it depends on how ready Heineke is, obviously. Like, obviously, my mind would change if he hasn't progressed at all. But I would prefer 2. But I think that you're right that they will carry 3. And the reason I'm thinking that is not necessarily that the Vikings would judge Heineke as unready. They might. But I think the thing that you said about how Sean Hill would probably have been cut by now otherwise. But the second thing is that the Vikings, Spielman made a huge deal of carrying 3 quarterbacks in the roster. I think just last year even. And then I think Norv Turner also made a pretty big deal of it, about how important it is to have 3 quarterbacks. And I don't think they're just going to move away from it at any point. Like, you could understand maybe that they would be saying it just because they maybe don't know as much about Teddy as they do now, but I don't think that was the reason. And the Vikings used to go to their 3rd quarterback a lot, including Teddy's rookie year, right? So, the Vikings went, I think they had 3 quarterbacks start a game in Teddy's rookie year, and like in the previous 10 years, it happened in 9 of those years. A pretty unusual rate. Like, most teams don't have this happen. But yeah, it certainly seems like the Vikings care a lot about having 3 quarterbacks. And it sucks because I think, like I said, I want there to be 2 quarterbacks. And one of the reasons I think that is not because, screw Sean Hill. I think that I think the Vikings fan base is now a little bit too aggressive about disliking him or anything like that. Because, he's a backup quarterback. And maybe don't put such high expectations on him. But the reason it sucks to me is because I think there's a lot of other interesting roster questions that get clouded up in this. Like the offensive line question, there's a bunch of people that they have reasons to keep, and that might, make it difficult. The fullback question, the tight end question, and we'll bring up a couple of these as we talk about them, through the rest of the segment. But there's a lot of places where they could keep a lot of people, and it's one of the reasons that they drafted 8 instead of 10 this year, is because there's a full-ish roster, and there's not a lot of places to make cuts. And so every roster spot's at a premium, and I would like there to be 2 quarterbacks, even though I think Sean Hill is underrated by a lot of the Vikings fan base, because it would relieve a lot of pressure throughout the rest of the roster.
Now, if we do that, though, we would have to consider the fact that McLeod Bethel-Thompson is available again to be picked up.
This is another reason to carry 2. You can pick up NBT at any time, basically.
He's played for everybody else. He might as well come back to the Vikings for a 3rd tour. He was just cut. Was it today or yesterday by the Eagles? So I feel like people have forgotten about MBT.
How could they forget?
It's like forgetting about Dre. You don't forget about Dre, and you don't forget about MBT. Not something you do. Yep, it was today that he was dropped.
In fairness, it was from the Eagles, who have 3 quarterbacks making $4 million or more. $6 million more, I think, is the first round money. But yeah, they paid Sam Bradford a lot of money, they paid Chase Daniel a lot of money, and then they drafted Carson Wentz. So not really MBT's fault. I mean, it is MBT's fault, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, he's collecting that check and moving on. I think I'd said something earlier to Eric Thompson about how I would totally go to the MBT quarterback. The quarterback training thing, or the weekend, a skills weekend or something. I would totally go to get the T-shirt, because just to have the full name just emblazoned on the front of the shirt.
It would be the full name, right? Because it'd be McLeod John Balthasar Bethel-Thompson,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I would go to his throwing camp. That would be fine. That would probably be almost as good as the Ray Finkel training camp T-shirt that I picked up a while back. Fantastic. Established 1994. Okay. Next up, let's talk about fullbacks. Do you think they're going to carry 1, 2, or 0 fullbacks coming into the next year?
I would say Zach Line's on the roster. I think Zach Line really did a lot of good things last year. I was actually really impressed with his season last year. I was one of the guys advocating for no fullback. But after I seen the versatility, he can do a lot of things, not just blocking, but in the passing game. And I think he's very effective after the catch. I think he can provide you a lot. I mean, with this roster being so constricted, like Arif said, I don't know how that's going to work out. But I think the fact that they gave Zach Line a contract, brought him back, they're obviously serious about keeping a fullback. And Zach Line produced very well last year. Actually, I was pretty happy with his productive season.
I actually disagree with you a little bit about how Line played last year. I was a lot less impressed with him. I thought that he improved dramatically over what he put together in 2014. But I still feel like if you carry a fullback, that he should provide more as a blocker than he did. And it's weird to say that I kind of agree with you about the assessment of skills, but disagree with what that means. Because I think you're right. I think that he's a pretty good pass catcher. I think he's underrated as a pass catcher. And I think that you're right that he does produce some pretty good yards after the catch. Kind of hard to tell sometimes because he's uncovered a lot. And so it's pretty easy to generate some yak when there's no defender on you. But, I still think that that's useful. Who cares, how he gets it? And even when he does get covered, I think that he can power through tackles pretty well. I think that he provides yards after the catch. I think that he's a pretty reliable passing option in the passing game. And I think that, the reason I'm not a huge fan of Zach Line is just because I think that your primary job as a fullback is to block. And if he was asked to catch the ball more often than he was asked to block, I wouldn't care about your literal job description. He's doing what he's supposed to do pretty well. But he's asked to block more often, and I think that he did improve over the course of the season, so I should be fair. I think that early in the season was a bigger problem from his blocking than later in the season. So in order to be fair, I mention that. Yeah. But I still think that he was not a good blocker when you compare him to other fullbacks whose only job, is on running plays is to block. So I think that if he's on the roster, that he should block better. And I think that if you cut him, you do it in favor probably of a skill position or an offensive lineman or whatever. You do it in favor of a skill position who can catch the ball better when they're on the field. Like, I think that his pass catching is a bonus. The only reason I think it's a bonus more than it is an asset is because if you don't have him on the roster, you probably have a better pass catching option that you can put on the field. So that's not as useful to me. I still don't think necessarily that means no fullback. The problem is the only other fullback the Vikings have on contract is Blake Renaud, a converted linebacker from Boise State, which, if Zach Line, who was a running back at SMU and technically a fullback, but he was just a ball carrier, is Zach Line, who actually, ran the ball from running formations, couldn't pick up being a fullback. Like, it's not like you can just project this guy who's a position convert to be pretty good. And I know that like a bunch of other teams have like defensive tackles play fullback and stuff like that, but their role as a fullback is much more limited than a fullback who's given that job. Like if you look at Kyle Juszczyk with the Baltimore Ravens, he's asked to do a lot of things, and I think that he does them pretty well. So it's not like I'm advocating, just put a defensive tackle out there, because it limits the plays which you can have a fullback on the field. And a lot of people, I remember when Norv Turner was signed, a lot of beat reporters were like, well, there goes the fullback position, which was really weird. Norv Turner has kept one or two fullbacks every single year that he's been in the NFL as an offensive coordinator or as a head coach. And the only exception could be with the Cleveland Browns, but the only reason that wouldn't count is because they had so many running back injuries that they converted their fullback to running back, and so it looks like he didn't keep one, but he did. And he's had two fullbacks before, not just with the Vikings with Jerome Felton and Zach Line, but also with the Chargers in multiple years with like Mike Tolbert and Jacob Hester. So I think that a lot of people kind of assume that Turner, because people assumed he was a pass-happy guy, which is not quite true. The fact that he likes to pass deep doesn't make him a pass-happy guy. Just assume that he didn't want a fullback. And I think there's a place for a fullback in the offense. I don't know where that comes from, because I just laid out a case against Zach Line, and I don't have a case for Blake Renaud. But I would like to see an alternate option at fullback. And yeah, I think that you could relieve some of that roster pressure by having no fullbacks and having Rhett and David Morgan sort of, fill in the void there.
Well, next thing we can talk about are the tight end position. And do you think we're going to end up with 4 tight ends actually being on the roster come the first week?
I think it's realistic to have 4 tight ends, but I have a steamy take. I'm not so certain Pruitt has a chance to make the team. That's kind of my hot.
Really?
That's
wow.
That's my hot and steamy take right there.
You got to back that one up with a lot. What's going on there?
I have an opinion that honestly, with Rudolph. And it all comes down to whether Rhett can physically play. If Rhett can physically play, I eliminate the fullback position with Zach Line, roll with Rhett, and go with David Morgan and Kyle Rudolph. I just don't feel like Pruitt really showed us a lot last season growth-wise. I felt at times he really did a lot during training camp and looked really good. But I just didn't feel like he didn't get many opportunities throughout the season. I want to see where he's at in training camp. Coming in, I'm not so certain he's an absolute lock. It's just my opinion. I feel like there's not a set in stone deal there. David Morgan can do a lot for you. He can play across a wide variety of positions. I think he gives you a lot of flexibility. He's got really good hands. The only problem is he's slow. So it just doesn't seem like Michael Pruitt has a spot here. The thing is he's a quicker tight end. I don't know. What's your take on it, Arif?
But before we do that, what's your take on Jimmy Clausen and whether or not he should come to the Vikings? If we're going to hot takes from the corner, I just want to know where we're at.
Ask Capital J that question, or whoever that guy is that runs that website. Let's send him an email and see if we get a response.
This is the most advertising VikingsCorner.com has ever received. So,
well, okay. So I think my thoughts on this are first that the Vikings are going to give him a longer leash, because the way that they've talked about him is that they've talked about him learning a new position, even though he played tight end in college, because they were like, well, he played the Y position, and we're asking him to play the F position. And so because of that, I think they're just going to give him a longer leash. Based off of what I've heard, I've heard that they liked him. But that was a long time ago. Like that was
long time ago.
Yeah. So like the last time I heard any opinions that they had of him was back in September. So a lot of things can change by then.
I heard the same thing as well. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So and so if you've heard that and you still have this take, it's not like you haven't processed that information. So a lot of things can change, but I think they're going to give Pruitt some more time, and I think that I think that there's actually not any reason to be necessarily all that disappointed with him because there's not a lot of reason for him to be on the field before Rhett's injury. And I thought that he did all right when he was on the field after Rhett got injured. So I don't think that there's any reason to get rid of him. And to me, the only reason that you would get rid of him is if you saw David Morgan as the kind of guy that was drafted because they're so disappointed in him. And I think
that's what I'm kind of leaning towards. I felt like it was kind of a disappointment that they picked a tight end in that spot. That kind of just surprised me. I don't know if it's more they're unconfident in Rhett or if they're unconfident in Pruitt. I don't know. It's tough to know.
Well, so my thought is this. On opening day, Norv Turner, and this is back to Norv Turner, roster philosophies. Back on opening day, I think Norv Turner has fielded a combination of 5 tight ends and fullbacks, so either 3 tight ends and 2 fullbacks or 1 fullback and 4 tight ends, going all the way back to his days in Dallas. I think there's only been 1 year where you haven't had 5. And I'm going to have to double check those numbers, but I'm pretty confident that he's always had 5 except for 1 year. And that I think that was true this year's opening day because Chase Ford was actually on the roster. So because of that, I think that they were just like, well, we don't have a 4th tight end and we don't want to carry 2 fullbacks this year. That would be your 4th tight end. And that's really simplistic. I think that there's like a lot of ways that you could interpret it differently, and like maybe if they cared that much about having 5, and maybe if it wasn't a coincidence, because when you look for trends, coincidences tend to pop up. If that's if it's not a coincidence, then you'd probably have to ask like, why would you cut Chase Ford or not bring him back or whatever, and only bring in or only bring in as a high priority guy David Morgan. But I still think that it's something to consider because it's just they want to have more functional players out there based off of Norv's playing style that don't necessarily have to catch the ball, that can do multiple things that are multidimensional like fullbacks and tight ends. They want to have more of them than most teams do, and I think that this is like an expression of that. So I think that it is unlikely, but I am so I'm so torn by the amount of pressure on the roster that's coming from the offensive line that they could, cut, Michael Pruitt after 1 year. Again, huge surprise to me if that happens. They could cut Michael Pruitt after 1 year just because of all that pressure that's being caused by the offensive line. And, maybe, and this is a scenario we talked about on the Cold Omaha podcast, maybe they pup Rhett Ellison, right? They just put him on the pup list for like 6 to 8 weeks or whatever it is. And then by the time he comes off the pup list, it's probably safer to cut, one of those offensive linemen that you're less impressed by.
Well, we can even go into that right now. They have a ton of offensive linemen. What are they going to be doing come week 1?
I mean, when I'm looking at this, I honestly think, kind of going back to the tight end before we get in the offensive line, with Pruitt and Morgan, I think you're right, Arif, with this current roster construction and all these offensive linemen, which we're leading into, it's going to come down to one of these tight ends making the team between Morgan or Pruitt, a fullback, or carrying 2 quarterbacks. That's honestly how I feel. So if you keep 3 quarterbacks and a fullback, it probably comes down to whether Rhett, Morgan, or Pruitt go. And I think they like Rhett a lot. I think it would take a lot for them to cut him. And I think Morgan is overall more flexible than Pruitt. So that's just kind of my last, testimony towards that.
Well, okay. Well, there is one other, before we get into the offensive linemen specifically, there's one other thing. They could carry 5 receivers instead of 6. Like, it is possible that either Johnson or Patterson get cut. Moritz doesn't make the team. Or maybe Thielen doesn't make the team, although that would surprise me. And it's just like Diggs, Treadwell, Wright, and like the remainder, like Thielen, Patterson, or Johnson. Like that is a possibility that they have 5 instead of 6.
Right, and then you could keep Pruitt because he's more of a pass catching, tight end, athletic tight end. I think,
Right.
It's going to come down to how this roster is constructed, and if we're looking at 6 wideouts, 3 quarterbacks, a fullback, I mean, it's going to come down to a tight end heading off and keeping 3.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting. That's a lot of interesting problems they'll have to deal with. But okay, so this all stems from, I think, this offensive line problem, right? And it's kind of a problem. It's kind of not. But so you've got Matt Khalil, Brandon Fusco, John Sullivan, Alex Boone, Phil Lodeholt, T.J. Clemmings, Mike Harris, Joe Berger, Andre Smith. That's 9 people before you get to any of the rookies or any of the guys that were at the bottom of the roster last year. And all of those people seem, at the moment, uncuttable, right? They seem like people that you would not cut because of either, they're developing, like TJ Clemmings. They were good last year, like Mike Harris. You just signed them to pretty good contracts, like Smith or Boone, or interestingly Khalil. Or it's Brandon Fusco. Might have been playing through injury because his strength was sapped versus what he was like in 2013. You're probably not cutting Phil. Probably would have cut him by now. All those guys seem difficult to cut. Then you've drafted Willie Beavers. Then you've got someone who's really promising, I think, in Austin Shepard and also Zach Kieran. And then they also traded, and I thought both of these were good trades. They also traded for Nick Easton and Jeremiah Searles. And then, just for kicks, they have Carter Bykowski on the roster too. So that's 9 offensive linemen that seem, maybe I'm wrong, and I'll talk about, after we get your take, I'll talk about, maybe how I could be wrong. But it seems like there's 9 offensive linemen that are difficult to cut. A 4th-round pick, very rarely cut. It made news when Vince Mailey was cut from the Browns last year as a 4th-round pick. So a 4th-round pick, difficult to cut. And 2 guys that, to me, are less difficult to cut than the 9 I named, but are still pretty promising in Zach Kieran and Austin Shepard. So what are your thoughts about this?
This is going to be the battle to watch at training camp. I think they're going to push these offensive linemen. I think that's why they brought in a lot of bodies. I think we're going to see a different culture with Tony Sperano. I think it's going to be tough, and they're going to get after it. And whoever can get after it the best is going to make the team. And as you said, this group is absolutely loaded. I like the Searles trade as well. I liked the Easton trade. I think both of those guys, I was kind of surprised last year when we got to the point where the offensive line was struggling so much that neither one of those guys got the opportunity to come in. It was to that point where something needed to give. And I'm not as high on Zach Kieran as you are. I like Zach Kieran, but in this room, I don't think he's kind of serviceable. Austin Shepard really was impressive to me. I'd like to see him get more of an opportunity. I think he played very well when he was in there in some of the heavy packages. I look at that Jerick McKinnon run in that Giants game. That was some beautiful stuff by Austin Shepard.
I love Austin.
I just don't see, I think Phil Lodeholt, one of those veterans, is going to go. I think if Phil Lodeholt looks any bit shaky, I think they'll roll with Andre Smith at right tackle. I'm not so certain. I'm not so certain with all the bodies that they have in here that they are confident that Sullivan and Lodeholt are 100% healthy. I just get that impression based upon the amount of people that are coming in here. I think that those two could be, a little more shaky than they're letting on.
No, that's a good point. That Lodeholt or Sully could be a greater risk than sort of I implied, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Lodeholt hasn't played a game in the last 23 games or something like that, and back injuries are difficult to come back from for Sully, right? And so with Lodeholt, you've had 2 consecutive injuries, I think, in Achilles and a pectoral, and with Sully, you've got that back issue, and so those are all But to me, the way that it seems like is that getting a lot of people is an insurance policy for if they can't come back. But if they are healthy, that creates some problems. And I think the 2 players that are at risk that maybe a lot of people don't think that they're at risk are Matt Khalil and Brandon Fusco. I think that if Fusco doesn't show the strength that he showed back when he was promising in 2012. And I was very critical of Brandon Fusco in 2012. I thought that Jeff Schwartz played a lot better than him and that he should have earned the start. And I understood why he didn't, because he was injured in the preseason and stuff like that. But I thought Schwartz was, a better player and they should have kept him. And I was very critical of Fusco. Turned in a phenomenal year in 2013. But if Fusco's strength isn't back, he could be cut. And I think he's a very low-risk cut. There's not a lot of dead money or whatever. And then you can roll with Alex Boone at your left guard, and it sounds like Alex Boone's going to be there anyway. And Mike Harris at your right guard, because Mike Harris was. A lot of people will say, and I think fairly, that Joe Berger was the better performing offensive lineman on that offensive line. I thought it was Mike Harris, but honestly, I think any argument for Berger is a good one. But yeah, Mike Harris, I thought he played really well at right guard, and I would like to keep him there. And Alex Boone was already told, I think, that he was going to compete for the left guard spot. So there's that. But the other one's Matt Khalil, because they gave him $12 million in guaranteed money or something some absurd amount of money because of the way the option is structured and the way the negotiations broke down. But that's a sunk cost. Like that, you're spending $12 million either way. Is it better to have Khalil on the roster than, Andre Smith at left tackle and Phil Lodeholt at right tackle or whatever? The problem is that after you get to potentially someone who hasn't played left tackle since college and Andre Smith playing left tackle, you don't really have a lot of options at left tackle. Now, I don't think Alex Boone is... I don't think they even thought of Alex Boone as a left tackle, but he was a phenomenal left tackle in college. He was thought of as a tackle in the draft, but when the 49ers drafted him, they had, great left tackle and a great right tackle. I think it was, Joe Staley and Anthony Davis, and they didn't have an answer at the guard spot, so they put the 6'8" guy with 36-inch arms at guard, and he played phenomenally. And so he's thought of as a guard. I think that he could be a left tackle, but that's only in the case where the Vikings seriously think of it, and it sounds like they don't. And that Matt Khalil gets cut, which I admit is kind of an outlier. But there's arguments for it, right? That it's a sunk cost. You're going to pay it either way. If you've got Boone at left tackle and Mike Harris at left guard, and I don't know. I don't know how you resolve this guard situation. They have Willie Beavers as a guard. If Nick Easton or Jeremiah Sirles comes out as a good guard, or Joe Berger, right? That would be a phenomenal guard spot, right? Then you've got a solution to the problem without having Matt Khalil on the roster, and you can keep Willie Beavers. So, and that's the person I keep forgetting about. Joe can play any of the guard spots or the center spot. So if Sullivan is healthy, you could have Joe play either guard spot, kick Boone out, or kick Andre Smith to left tackle or whatever, and you can find a way to cut Matt Khalil, even though you've sunk some cost into him. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's any question that this is the deepest group of offensive linemen I've seen heading into a training camp in the last 10 plus years. I mean, this is just unreal, the amount of bodies they have in here that are actually capable of being serviceable. I mean, they mean business by bringing in all this competition. I don't see Matt Khalil going anywhere. I think, the idea that they exercised the contract, there's just no way he's going anywhere. I think Fusco, people need to give him a shot. I think last year I've kind of gotten the feeling that he was not 100% at all coming off that injury, and that he was not at full strength until, end of the season. And he says he's been progressing this offseason in an interview that I heard with him a little while back. I think it's the more interesting thing to me is the fact that they're saying they're moving TJ Clemmings to left tackle. I think
but they don't intend on starting him there. That's for sure. They want to give him another year.
I think so too, but I think it's interesting because it's like they have someone waiting in the wings behind Khalil. I just get that impression that this is Khalil's make it or break it year. It absolutely is his make it or break it year. But I think they're setting themselves up to be, flexible in the event that they have some problems. And I think they have more flexibility now with bringing in Andre Smith. I think you could move him to the left side. There's a lot of things you could do. Move Boone out. I think that's the beauty of bringing in as many capable and versatile bodies that you can, both at guard and tackle, that have position flexibility. I mean, Joe Berger, I'm in the opinion that John Sullivan and Phil Lodeholt won't play all season. I really don't think that those two can recover from what they've endured.
So your offensive line as it stands right now is Khalil, Boone, Berger,
For sure.
Harris.
Fusco.
Oh, Fusco on the right?
Fusco on the right, yeah. Yep, so it'd be Khalil, Boone, Berger, Fusco on the right, and Andre Smith at right tackle.
But Harris outplayed Fusco last year. Do you think that Fusco recovers enough to return to sort of his 2013 form?
I do. I think he recovers and plays very, very well. I think that'll be an interesting battle to watch if there's in preseason. If Fusco struggles, they'll play Mike Harris. They will. They're not going to be afraid. It's going to be an open competition. I think the amount of money that they invested in Fusco, they're going to give him every opportunity to show that he can do it again.
I totally understand that. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, okay, so this question I think is important too because it's related, I think, to because you believe very strongly it's an open competition, and that makes sense to me. It felt like to me under Jeff Davidson and Musgrave and a little bit of Turner too, but like mostly Jeff Davidson, it felt like at times they valued chemistry too much, and by chemistry, I actually mean continuity, like because sometimes even NFL coaches, it seems like will confuse the two, or because of one, focus on the other, and I feel like they valued continuity too much in favor of chemistry at the risk of talent issues. I think that was the issue with Charlie Johnson. I think that's why even after they saw him play a season at guard, they re-signed him to play guard again, and until they were like, well, that's not working, we have to cut him. And is a reason that they've pursued some of the roster building strategies that they have. Do you think that under Sperano, they're going to value continuity less relative to individual talent?
I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I mean, I really think that Davidson overvalued the continuity. I think Sperano's philosophy is going to be totally different. And I think that's what Zimmer was looking for when he hired an offensive line coach. He wanted a guy that was going to bring in all the bodies possible and find the best mix. And I think that's a better philosophy than, keeping a guy, like you said, like Charlie Johnson and running him out there and, let's keep this guy that's almost not even mediocre because he's familiar with the guys playing to the right and left of them.
Right.
That just doesn't make sense to me. Bring in the guy and find the right mix that can give you the best possible protection up front. And I think they've done that by trading for Surlis, and Easton, bringing in, drafting Willie Beavers, and just adding as much talent, signing Andre Smith. I just get the impression that they're not completely comfortable that Sullivan and Lodeholt will be back. I really don't. I don't think you can be 100% certain with those types of injuries and how they'll handle and be durable. I mean, maybe they'll play 6 games, and how are they going to hold up? That's what I keep coming back to.
Right. No, I mean, that's a fair question, especially because of the nature of Sully's injury and the constancy of Lodeholt's absence. I guess before we move on from the offensive line, one last thing, and I'm not trying to trap you because I should have researched this and I didn't, so I don't actually know the answer. But like, how often do you know of that Sperano, who has been able to influence or make these decisions as either an offensive line coach or a head coach? How often do you think Sperano has benched an offensive lineman? Do you know if he's benched an offensive lineman mid-season? Because I think it would speak really strongly to your argument that continuity is not something that he'll overvalue, say, relative to other things. And I'm thinking, and I don't have an example because I don't know when this may have happened, but I'm thinking maybe the best example would be if he had benched Menelik Watson, over the course of the season. And again, I don't know if he did, but Watson is basically his biggest mistake, I think, as an offensive line coach / head coach in terms of like who he's evaluated, and he's generally speaking, been on evaluation teams that have drafted really good offensive linemen. Jake Long, Marquise Pouncey, Gabe Jackson. So the only mistake would have been Menelik Watson, and so he may have been the only person that could have been benched midseason. I know Watson didn't play last year because of an Achilles tendon injury, but if he'd been benched, maybe that's a reason. I don't know. I don't know if anyone else has been benched midseason as an offensive lineman under Sperano. Do you know?
I'm not so certain that I have heard that has happened. I guess I'd have to look into it more like you said. But I get the impression that that's not going to be an issue. Like, Zimmer has always said that we're going to find, and Spielman was even saying this, we're going to bring in the best 90 football players we can. And Zimmer continues to say that too. He's always said that. We're going to put the best players we can out on the field. And I think, honestly, I don't think Zimmer and Davidson's personalities meshed very well. I think that continuity philosophy with Davidson and that overarching Zimmer, we're going to put the best player out there philosophy kind of collided a little bit more than people knew. I think, he gave him a chance to figure it out last year, Davidson, and it got worse. And now I feel like he wanted to bring in a hard-nosed guy that was willing to make some tough decisions. And I think that's kind of evident with the hire that they made and the personality they brought in.
Yeah, Sperano is well known for being a bit of a hard ass. He comes from the Parcells tree, just like Zimmer, and so I can totally see, that sort of thing happening. And hopefully, this is the kind of, because I think that I tend to undervalue, this sort of thing a lot. But I still think that even if I account for that in my head or whatever. I still think that it is well within truth that continuity was overvalued under Davidson. So even if you just replace Davidson with an average coach who does not overvalue things, which I think Sperano is maybe a little bit more than, you're probably going to get a higher value placed on individual talent when it comes to that sort of thing. So hopefully, that's the situation.
Well, let's move on from our team building discussion and head on down to the mailbag. We have a couple of great questions. And the first thing that keeps getting asked is, I'll have this one from Sounder Till I Die, who asks, when is Justice going to be back on the show?
When we get some guarantee that he's not going to ruin the show like he has the other 4 or 5 other times.
Oh, God. No, there's no way that we're going to get a guarantee like that. Justice...
That's true. Would we believe Justice anyway?
No. God, no. No. As the producer of this show, no. There's not a chance in hell I believe that. But we will have Justice on. I imagine we will have Justice on soon. Hell, I hear the Vikings and the Packers are playing each other in week 1.
Huh. Interesting.
That is how that works. So
it's actually week 2.
It is week 2. That's right. So early in the season we can bring him on. And then that'll be the last show.
Right.
That will be the end of that. Next question from ES Ramsvike, who asks, why are so many of the national media down on Teddy?
House, do you want to take this one for a second before I do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take this one. I just think that they seem to just want to find a way to nitpick Bridgewater just because the Vikings have notoriously had quarterback problems, and I think they look at the situation not being any different. I think Teddy has just got such a different personality. He's, a very soft-spoken guy, and he didn't show immediate growth in between the first and second year, and I think a lot of people get concerned about that. I just feel like the national media just seems to like to get things started with Teddy for some reason. I guess I don't really know why they do that. I think it's just something that's brought up a lot because people seem to not be very confident in Teddy's ability. That's really all I can say about it. I think they just think it's some entertainment value. I'm not as down on Teddy as the national media, that's for sure. What's your take, Arif?
Well, I totally agree with you on that in terms of whether or not Teddy is a fine quarterback or not. I agree. I'm not as down on Teddy as the national media. As for why, I think that's a difficult question to answer, but I do know there are some things that come up when they talk about him. Now, whether or not those things drive, whether or not they harp on Teddy, or whether or not those things are just used because they harp on Teddy, that one's more difficult. So, if they just have some sort of grudge or vendetta against Teddy, I can't speak to that, but I do know that they tend to focus on easy-to-digest numbers a lot more often, and those numbers are touchdown numbers. Blake Bortles, 35 touchdowns. Turns out he actually was not that great of a quarterback last year. And I think that, one of the things that people, and by people I in particular do mean national media because I think it's different for a lot of different, national media. It's just, it's when you take a look at these aggregate numbers, you get to look at things like total passing yards, right? And Derek Carr and Blake Bortles, who Teddy is always going to be compared to because they were in the same draft class, fairly or unfairly, have more passing yards. Derek Carr had nearly 4,000. He had 3,987. Blake Bortles had 4,400, 4,428. And Teddy had 32, right? 3,200. So it looks like, a lot of people care about total passing yards, which is, ridiculous, right? Because a lot of good quarterbacks, they don't tend to necessarily throw the ball that often. Because they don't throw the ball that often, they have fewer total passing yards. And I think that if you look at it from an efficiency perspective, you're going to go better. But even then, I think from a passer rating perspective, I think that Derek Carr's was definitely higher. I think Blake Bortles was about equal to Teddy's, but people like the 35 touchdowns thing. And Blake Bortles, he threw the ball 150 times more than Teddy did, so he's going to get, better total passing yards and stuff like that. But I think those easy to digest numbers are really important. And then for some reason, people don't look at at things like yards per attempt. They don't look at things like, hey, even at ESPN, where they've invented the total QBR statistic, where I used to be totally down on the QBR statistic, and then they liked the player that I liked. I was able to run some tests on it. And total quarterback rating actually does a pretty good job of predicting quarterback performance in a way that I hadn't anticipated, because I thought it was a poorly designed metric. I got burned by how they did clutch weighting. They've gotten rid of that now. And of those, 3 quarterbacks, Teddy's is the best. And one of the reasons is because of things like dropped interceptions. One of the things is because they normalize for play under pressure. And that's another reason. I think that they know, they intuitively, they know if you ask them, they know that Teddy had a bad offensive line, but they don't take that into account when they talk about Teddy's play last year. They're like, oh, he only threw, for 7.2 yards per attempt, which, by the way, league average. And they don't take into account the fact that he was pressured on 40% of his snaps. Very difficult to throw for league average yards per attempt. So I think a lot of the things that Teddy does well are things that are either not captured by statistics or happen to be captured by statistics that are not incorporated by a lot of the media. So I think that's all related together. But I can't separate, whether or not they want to harp on Teddy because of, for reasons that you talk about, like maybe they've got this understanding that Vikings quarterbacks don't tend to be very good. Maybe they carried the bias that it seems that they showed against Teddy throughout the draft. Maybe the bias against quarterbacks they don't perceive as having strong arms. Maybe Teddy didn't wish them a happy birthday. I don't know the reason. But maybe they use these as reasons. Maybe these are the real reason, or maybe they just use these as reasons. But these are all things that have built up a case against Teddy. Some of it fair. He should throw for more touchdowns, and some of that was his fault. Some of it unfair. And I think that his statistical case hasn't been laid out in a way that people understand.
How about this as a possibility? This is a very, very, very fantasy-driven world as far as football is concerned. And Bridgewater was not
that's a
good
point.
Fantasy player last year.
Fancy option. Yeah,
it was just absolutely not, and caused many people on the waiver wire to pick him up and watched him throw picks or watched him overthrow receivers and all these things. So there may just be a little bit of bias based on simply that, in that, clearly Bortles is a better QB because, he was such a great fantasy pick this last year that, we should watch out for his explosion this year. Yeah, maybe, but I don't necessarily think that's a really good way of basing that sort of decision.
Yeah,
Put it this way. I think national media, they're looking at the box score. They're looking at the really sexy stat that 5 touchdowns. Teddy doesn't give you that, kind of like what you were saying, Arif, and the fantasy football idea. People like us and people that follow a certain team, they're going to look in depth. They're going to watch every game. These national media guys aren't watching every game, and they're definitely not breaking it down to the level that some of us are. That's kind of another thing that could you could talk about.
Yeah, no, I think that all plays a role, and I think here's the thing. I'm a huge stat head, right? Like, I talk about numbers all the time. I was talking about numbers at times where it may not even make sense to talk about numbers, so I get it. Like, if I talk about aggregate statistics and yards per attempt and stuff like that. So I don't want to necessarily judge people for, and you're right. If you're a national media personality, you need to have a beat on all 32 teams. You're sacrificing depth for breadth. And that's fine. That's your job. And unfortunately for Teddy, the things that the numbers that he produces are not gaudy, like you said. Like when people look at box scores, and I think that it's okay to, over the course of a long period of time, look at box scores and judge quarterbacks. I get it, especially if you don't have much time. But I think that you're right, that a more in-depth look at Teddy would reveal a better quarterback than a lot of the perception. But I think that this fantasy football idea is actually, I can't believe I didn't even touch on it. That's a great reason because he is an abysmal fantasy quarterback. He also threw for like the fewest attempts or second fewest attempts out of the top 32 quarterbacks in attempts. So, that's probably a reason that a lot of fantasy analysis doesn't really like him. Like a lot of people who are familiar with Teddy from a fantasy perspective, and maybe it's one they don't take into account. Or maybe they're like, well, if maybe he wasn't good because they didn't throw it so often. Like maybe they would have thrown it more if he was good, which actually there's a study put together by Football Perspective just like 2 weeks ago that indicates that passing efficiency and throwing attempts by team are not related at all. Some teams that are good, that have good passers, throw a lot. Some teams that are good, that have good passers, run out the clock. And some teams that are bad throw a lot because they're behind, or some teams that are bad run a lot because their passers are bad, right? And so like they don't relate at all. And this is a study done over the course of several seasons and also within this last season. So there's not a relationship between the two, but people tend to assume that there is. So I think this fantasy thing plays a big role. And I think that people also just assume that if you're not the best quarterback in your class, you're a bad quarterback, right? Like if Derek Carr is the better quarterback between the three quarterbacks we're talking about plus Johnny Manziel, then people just assume the other quarterbacks are maybe not as good. And I agree. Right now, Derek Carr seems like the better quarterback. Although if you only looked at the last 8 games of this past season, Teddy's probably a better quarterback. But over the course of the season, Derek Carr, better quarterback. And probably in actuality a better quarterback. That's fine. I'm fine by saying that. But because of that, you're just like, well, then maybe Teddy's not good. Maybe because I like Blake Bortles more, Teddy can't be good. How likely is it that you're the third best quarterback of your class and still good? Like not every draft is the 1983 draft or the 2004 draft. So how likely is it? So that might play a role too.
Well, let's bring up the next question. Just from BC Light, who says, do Thielen's multi-dimensional special team contributions suggest that his roster spot might be safer than Patterson's?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think so. I think Thielen's ability to contribute in special teams is really underrated. He's one of the more solid special teams contributors, I think, in the league, personally. I think he does an excellent job. I think Patterson, he gives you the return, the return yardage, but Patterson's ability to run routes and understand the offense is nowhere near Thielen's. I mean, Thielen did some really good things in the passing game last year down the stretch. I mean, very underrated there too. I mean, I think overall, it's going to come down to what these other receivers can do. I'm interested to see how Troy Stoudemire fits into this mix. I think he could potentially take some of these return reps away from Patterson, and they might give him a little bit more of a look. I think that could be an interesting storyline to follow as well. But I think Thielen, the overall question, Thielen's special teams ability gives him a huge advantage over Patterson, through my eyes at least.
Yeah, I think so. This is an interesting question, a really interesting question, I think, because the question ultimately boils down to whose special teams abilities are more replaceable, and they're completely different questions because Thielen's ability is multiple. I mean, he works on all 4 units. He works really well on all 4 units, and it's very difficult to be good at a lot of the things that he's very, very good at, and so. The individual things that he's good at are more replaceable than the individual thing that Patterson's good at. But the combination of things that he's good at, his ability to actually even return punts. He was actually all right as a punt returner. And I remember people talking about how Thielen was going to replace Marcus Sherrills, but people forgot that, of course, that Marcus Sherrills is a cockroach and never dies. I mean, he's a really good punt returner, so it's not like, I dislike him or anything. I actually like him a lot. But, that's a thing to take into account. He's also a good punt returner. He's a really good up back in punt protection, which is, they had Sendejo play that role. They had Harrison Smith play that role once. They usually have a safety play that role, but he's played that role and he's played it really well. He's great as a gunner. He's great in kickoff coverage. He's great even when he's blocking. Sometimes he can jam as a blocker, as a jammer, and then sometimes he'll actually play behind the line of scrimmage. Not that often. You're not going to see a bunch of tape of him doing it, but he can still do that, and that's typically reserved for the special teams linebackers like Kentrell Brothers or Larry Dean, or for a while, E.J. Henderson or Aaron Henderson. Sorry, that's amazing. Like he can do that, and so that's difficult to replace. But you can find individual players that can perform all those roles really well. Possibly some of those individual roles better than he does. Patterson, it's difficult to find an individual role, or difficult to find a player that is better at his individual role. And you can talk about his kickoff return average, which has led the league, I think, 2 of the past 3 years, and over the course of 3 years, all combined has led the league. But that's not a good stat because he returns a lot of kicks from like deep, and that inflates his kickoff return average. But a great stat for Patterson is the Vikings' average field position from kickoffs. The Vikings have led every single year that Patterson has been on the roster. They have led the league in field position after kickoff returns. So that takes into account, where he's going to return a kick. That takes into account how explosive his kick returns are. And here's another key thing. That takes into account the fact that they kick away from him. So those are all things that he creates. And if you put Thielen back there, or if you put Sherrills back there, or if you put Stoudemire back there, or, Moritz or whoever, right? You're probably not going to lead the league in kickoff return average or field position after a kickoff, right? And that's really difficult to replace. But I still think, and those are all just considerations. I just wanted to put that out there. I still agree with you, Daniel, that I think Thielen is less replaceable on the roster than Patterson is. Thielen can contribute as a receiver in a way that I think Patterson cannot. I think a lot of people are glossing over the fact that Patterson's had a lot of difficulty picking up the playbook. I mean, here's the thing that people don't seem to understand is that the reason Patterson's not seeing the field is not because Norv Turner's like a stubborn dick. It's because he's not picking up the offense. He runs the wrong routes when he's on the field. He runs routes at the wrong depth when he's on the field, and that's inexcusable. You can't have that. So you can't put that on the field. You can't put Thielen on the field, and maybe, Thielen's not as good as Charles Johnson or whoever, but who cares? I mean, he runs the right routes. He doesn't automatically take himself out of the play by being there.
And he's an old dick.
and Norv Turner's a stubborn old dick. But yeah, I think that Thielen's ability to contribute on offense matters. And I think that you're right. Stoudemire, who I believe has the FBS record in kickoff return yardage or something like that.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. I can't believe that's not more publicized. That's relevant. I think Stoudemire, plays a big role in this conversation. I think Moritz, who returned 2 of 15 kickoffs in Germany for touchdowns, which leads the league. It led the league in touchdowns per kickoff return. By the way, fun stat. Actually, I think his teammate, the one the Packers signed, leads the league, but he's second. And he had better yards per return than anybody else except for that guy again from Southern Oregon, NAIA, 5'9", 180 pounds, probably won't make the team. But Moritz might be a good kick returner. What people saw in minicamp, he was actually pretty good at catching kick returns. And he needs to be a little bit more sudden coming out of the kick return, but he's from Germany, whatever, give him a break. But he could take, the kickoff return spot. He could be an average kick returner. That's enough for me to cut Patterson. It's Sherrills, fine kick returner, probably an above average kick returner. That could be enough to cut Patterson. So I think Thielen's roster spot is safer, but there's a lot more to consider than simply Patterson is just a good kick returner, because he's more than that. He does a lot for the Vikings merely as a kick returner.
And I think it comes back to competition again. Bringing in Stoudemire, bringing in, Boehringer. I mean, there's a lot of guys that can push Patterson. I think people aren't talking about that enough. The fact that, these two guys could really push for time. And I think, like you're saying, Patterson's value is very good in special teams. Thielen provides you a wider variety of special teams value. But when you look at what they bring you from an offensive perspective, and you look at the versatility and the wide variety of areas Thielen can play on special teams, that's more valuable. So if you can find a guy on your roster that can give you the same, contributions in the kick game and have the potential to develop into a better receiver because Patterson can't get the playbook, I mean, it makes more sense. You just got to weigh your options there. It's worth looking into, I think, and evaluating in camp.
Yeah, and Stoudemire and Boehringer and Sherrills are evidence that Patterson can either be a 0-for-1 replacement if it's Sherrills or a 1-to-1 replacement if it's Boehringer or Stoudemire. That's just the replacement, right? Like, it's a 1-to-1 replacement. If Thielen gets replaced, you need a couple of guys on special teams to stand up, and that might mean rostering someone who's not as good at his position as Thielen is at his, right? Like, you're going to need someone who can be an up back. Maybe it's Sendejo. You're going to need someone who can jam. You're going to need someone who can be a punt gunner. And, hey, the Vikings have a great punt gunner in Trey Waynes. Maybe he's not a punt gunner anymore. You have to take that into consideration. You're going to need someone who can play the kickoff coverage game as well as he does. You're going to need a lot of special teamers to step up or be on the roster, and maybe you have to downgrade at a position in order to do it. Whereas for Patterson, you only got to replace one guy, maybe 0 guys.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the next question here from at Justin M. Rubin, who says, now that we've had 3 drafts with Zimmer, has an archetype emerged in the same way that certain players seem like a New England or a Seattle guy?
Yeah, but the archetype is, for me anyway, it's super cliche and it's not necessarily all that useful. The archetype is someone who is physical, who is smart, who is athletic, and those are the 3 things. But every team is going to say that. The Vikings have demonstrated a consistent ability to value these traits. Like, all of the players that they get, most of the players that they get in the draft, share these traits. And it's actually, the combination of the 3 traits is actually not all that easy to find, because it's difficult to find, an athlete who is smart, who is also physical, or it's difficult to find someone who is physical and smart but is also a high-level athlete. But I mean, like, by using the term athlete or by using the term smart, you're making a relative comparison that there's actually very few people who are as good at this particular trait as this person. So it's difficult to find the combination of those 3 traits, but I think that they consistently find them. Like, Crichton may not necessarily be a good player, but he was an athlete, he's physical, and he's smart. Same with Danielle Hunter, same with Anthony Barr, same with Eric Kendricks. All of these people are above-average athletes. Not necessarily everybody. Laquan Treadwell is not necessarily an above-average athlete, but the Vikings think he's athletic in at least one sense. And so they find athletes who are above average in at least one dimension, who are smart, who pick up stuff really quickly, and play physical football.
I agree. The Vikings really, I don't know if it's an archetype. I think it's more they're using the analytics to their advantage. I think they're looking at the guys coming out that just fit the Zimmer brand of football, the tough, passionate, and smart players. And I think they're also looking at, the analytics side of football and finding guys that can be coached. When you have a coaching staff that can develop players like the Vikings have, it gives you a lot more flexibility to find raw guys like a Danielle Hunter that just need a little coaching. That's the advantage where, New England or Seattle, I'm not sure they're the prototype drafting a guy that's, analytically driven. I just feel like the Vikings have their own mold. And I think it's a good mold. I think it's unique. And I think it's something that they can potentially build upon moving forward. I think it's a thing that Spielman really is kind of secretive about. You get that impression, like he feels like they have something special there. I think that's kind of the unique thing about how the Vikings run their team and how they're building their roster.
Yeah, a lot of the players that they've selected have really strong analytical cases. Either because of like combine metrics, which I think at this point is pretty well known that the Vikings at pass rusher have been drafting force players. Justice Mosqueda's force players. I mean, the Vikings just draft them. It's nuts how consistent that is. I think they're the only team that does it. The only pass rusher that they've drafted that I think that's not in recent years is B.J. DuBose, who's a defensive tackle kind of anyway. So, yeah, that's true. I think that they tend to get receivers that are analytically, they've got a pretty strong case. And, Laquan Treadwell actually does have some strong analytical cases for him, even though I wasn't as big a fan as a lot of people were. I think that a lot of these players fit analytical molds really well. Anthony Barr did, Eric Kendricks did, Trey Waynes. Not to me, but I think there were other strong analytical cases. And I think even before the Trey Waynes draft, Spielman was a lot more open than you'd expect, talking about what they look for in cornerbacks. And he talked about like these combine metrics from a study that they commissioned that year. So I think that you're right. I think that one of the things that they look at, and maybe we don't know what those analytical thresholds are, but they all have strong cases to be made from the data that we have available.
Well, let's move on to the next question from Skull Page, who asks, why didn't we see more of Jerick McKinnon and Adrian Peterson on the field together last season? Will we see it more this year?
I think it starts with the protection was so bad up front, they needed an extra tight end a lot. They were chipping a lot on the line of scrimmage, and I think with this, offensive line competition that we alluded to earlier, I think that gives you a little more flexibility to do some more things and have, Jerick and AP on the field together. I think, this offense, AP is more, driven to be that single back guy, that drive it, 6 yards behind the line of scrimmage and just drive it. I just don't feel like last year they had the resources to have two running backs on the field just because they're so weak up front. I think that was a lot of it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think there's two reasons, and I think that the reason that you gave is the primary reason, because the pass protection was so bad they kept a tight end in, not even necessarily just a chip, although that happened a lot. They also kept a tight end in to just pass block, to spend the entire rep just blocking, and that was one of the reasons that I thought T.J. Clemmings had such a bad season he did. And, everyone knows that TJ Clemmings had a bad season, so it's not like I'm revealing some earth-shaking revelation. But he was actually worse than a lot of people realize because he had a lot of help from tight ends. A lot. I don't know how to emphasize this. A lot of help from tight ends. And it boggles my mind that there was actually a worse player at tackle last year, Eric Flowers, New York Giants, first-round pick, than TJ Clemmings. And I don't blame Clemmings at all. Despite seeing that, I think that he's a fine pick. But I think that because of that, I think that you're right that you limited your options. There was a lot more two receiver sets, or there was a lot more one back sets. And in situations where you wanted to run the ball, they wanted better blocking, and Jerick McKinnon's not going to do that. Obviously, he's not going to do that. But Zach Line might, or a tight end might. So those are, but the second reason I think is there's just not that many plays in North Carolina's playbook for having two running backs who are running backs and not fullbacks on the field at the same time, and it's difficult to install plays that are not in the playbook midway through the season. It happens, but you don't get very many of them, and so it's not a useful expenditure of Norv Turner's time to create a play for two running backs and then install the play. Spend part of a limited practice installing the play instead of shoring up one of the many weaknesses the offense already had for a play that I'm not even confident there's a lot of options to have both of them on the field at the same time. I did like seeing it. I thought those plays were phenomenal when both of them were on the field at the same time. I thought that was very exciting. Just like that many plays, there's not many opportunities to put it there, and there's not a lot of situations. You don't want it on 1st and 10 necessarily. Maybe at 2nd and 5 or whatever, but you don't want it on 3rd and short. So there's not a ton of situations where it makes sense. Not a ton of plays where it exists, and your opportunity was restricted by the talent gaps that you had up front. So yeah, I think those are the reasons. I think you're right.
Next question is from Richard Snowden, who asks, does Treadwell encourage Norv's 7-step drop obsession, or does he promote a faster passing game that Teddy does so well?
Oh, that's a good question.
I don't think it really encourages Norv's 7-step drop obsession. I honestly think it will promote a little bit of a quicker passing game. I think Laquan can do a lot, in the intermediate routes, the mediocre routes. I think he not only can do that, but he can, just provide you so much, not just vertically, up the field with that 7-step drop, but I think between the hashes he can do a lot too. I just don't think that that's going to change the philosophy a lot, but I think having more weapons is always going to allow you to develop your playbook to suit your quarterback a little more. I think maybe we'll see some more of that. I guess we can't really get into that until we see more of training camp, I guess. What's your take, Arif?
No, that's actually a good point, that what Treadwell excels at are not the plays that tend to come from 7-step drops. And, maybe the curl routes that Treadwell is going to run, and he runs them really well. Maybe the ones that he runs rely on 7-step timing instead of like 5-step timing or 3-step timing or whatever. But I think that you're right. I mean, like these slants, you don't want a 7-step slant that's not a slant. And he's really good at slants. He's really good at curls. He's, pretty good at outs. Especially quick outs, and those are not 7-step stuff. So that's actually a really good point. I didn't actually consider that immediately when I thought of that question, so I'm glad you brought it up. Beyond that, I think passing more doesn't necessarily mean doing more of the thing that you were doing prior. Like if you desire big plays, maybe it means more 7-step drops. But if you desire more consistent passing, maybe it doesn't. And I think two other things to consider is that, and this is something I dismissed, and I was pretty wrong about this. Two other things to consider is that Shermer and Sperano have a lot of influence on the offense this year. The Vikings basically just said that they do. And Shermer, West Coast guy, shorter passing guy, came from Philadelphia where they had both a lot of short passes and a bunch of long passes, not that many intermediate passes, but a lot of short passes. And then, you've got Sperano, who sees passing more as an extension of the running game anyway, whose quarterbacks have not always taken, 7-step drops. I think that when he's been sort of on the offensive side of the ball, the quarterbacks have been a lot more typical in terms of 5-step drops. So both of those guys, if they influence the offense, will probably influence a quicker passing game. I think having more receivers on the field makes it more likely you're going to have fewer steps in your drop because you're going to have receivers running at all levels. You have the ability to spread out a defense, which means you don't have to wait for someone to get open, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that maybe Treadwell does not encourage more bad play design.
Next question is from Jordan C. Burrell, who simply states, starting O-line prediction.
Well, we already got Daniels, right? Unless what you said mine. Is okay. That's your prediction. Okay. Mm-hmm. So my prediction, I'm gonna go bold. I think I'm probably wrong, but I'm gonna go with what I like. I like Alex Boone at left tackle. I already said I'm already wrong, but I like Alex Boone at left tackle.
That's not a noise guests usually make on this show. That's usually one that the people have to pay for.
If you look at Alex Boone at Ohio State, he was a great left tackle. So, screw all the haters. So Alex Boone at left tackle. Then at left guard, Berger. Center, Sullivan. I have hashtag faith. At right guard, Michael Harris. I don't have hashtag faith in Fusco, although he should have stayed on the right the entire time. And then at right tackle, Phil Lodeholt, because I also have hashtag faith in him. What does that mean for Andre Smith? Who knows? That's a problem. Maybe Andre Smith plays left tackle and Alex Boone plays left guard. That would be fine with me. Andre Smith played left tackle for 4 years. He was a freshman starter, 4 years at Alabama. Unless I'm confusing him with Boone, who was a freshman starter. It was either 4 or 3 years left tackle, and he moves like Lodeholt, so he doesn't move well laterally, but like it's not like Matt Khalil moves well laterally either. Like if you just have a bad left tackle, that's bad. So when he's good, he gets the first punch just like Phil Lodeholt does, and he can contain speedy edge rushers in the same way that Phil Lodeholt has learned how to do. So you could have him, but my prediction right now is Boone, Berger, Sully, Harris, Lodeholt, and that's a That's way wrong. That relies on 2 unhealthy players being healthy and Boone being given a task that he did not sign up for.
That is a steamy exothermic take right there. Wow.
Yeah, whatever, Pruitt's going to be cut.
Yeah, I had a steamy take as well, too. So everybody's got to have one.
Yeah, there you go.
That's, wow. I'm hearing the sizzling.
It's pretty good. Speaking of sizzle, let's go with the next question from Admiral Big Gun, who asks, if the Vikings were going to kill and grill a special cut of meat for the first game at US Bank Stadium, what would it be? Now, I have an answer for this that is going to be unique for this, simply because of my location. The first Wolverine found in the state of North Dakota in like 100 years happened last week.
Oh, when he got shot.
And immediately killed, yeah. We don't fuck around with Wolverines in the state of North Dakota.
That was so funny. Yes, I remember you well, North Dakota. That's totally believable.
It totally is. It came in from Wyoming. We found it and we killed it. So I feel like ribs of Wolverine seem like an appropriate. If we're going, there's 300 of them according to Wikipedia. There's 300 of them left in the lower 48. So if we're going like,
Jesus,
if we're going special cut of meat, I say ribs of Wolverine.
Wow, 300. Wow. That's so sad.
Wow.
Good job,
and
Dakota.
Tasty.
All right, what non-depressing prediction do you have, Daniel?
I don't think you kill and grill anything. I think you just grill cheese for the first regular season game. I think it's just grilled cheese.
That's such a weak answer.
I expect, after some hot takes, I expected something like something.
Oh, you know, the Vikings are going to get some grilled cheese sandwiches. It's going to be really nice. Don't have to kill anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, they're playing the Packers' first regular season game at US Bank, so I mean, grilling some cheese is probably a good thing to do.
But you could put cheese on things.
Yeah. Oh,
I guess you could.
It's too bad that the Packers released John Coon, because you could have put raccoon and then cheese on raccoon.
What if it's John Coon? What if they kill and grill John Coon?
Oh God, no!
Wait, no, that's murder. That's illegal.
that would be a very special cut of meat. You are at this. Nothing was said about whether or not it was legal. I'm fairly certain it's not legal to kill a Wolverine and serve it at US Bank Stadium.
Understanding that the word illegal is a discrete term, I will still say this: killing a human is more illegal than killing a Wolverine.
All right, so if you're going to take anything away from this episode, it's that it's okay to lie to a reef, and it's okay to make fun of him, and it's not okay to kill a man. It's much more okay to kill a Wolverine. Okay.
These are all fine. I mean, I don't want people to lie to me, but I mean, if that's the takeaway overall.
and you can pay a reef to not be blocked by him.
Well, okay, so
these are life lessons.
So actually, I hadn't considered that it was the Packers game, so good argument. But Mike Zimmer's a hunter. Brian Robinson's a hunter. Teddy learned to hunt. Probably not a hunter, but learned to hunt. A lot of hunters on the team. Alex Boone, huge hunter, right? So it should be deer, right? Like it's like a very Minnesota thing to kill and grill. It should be venison. And in honor of Chad Greenway, like little venison cubes. What do they call them in South Dakota? Like chitlins or something like that? It's a very South Dakota thing to just have like toothpicks of venison cube.
The last question we have is from Tommy Gunn, who asks a very important question that's important today anyway. So, who did win the NFC North this year? Oh, Bill Barnwell. I don't even think it was Barnwell's fault. It had to be an editor. Somebody messed up that, claiming that the Packers won the North last year.
Somebody's getting the axe. Ooh-wee.
People have been fired for less at ESPN.
Well, I don't think they've been fired for thinking the Packers won when they didn't win. I think that's a pretty common ESPN take. Just saying.
Yeah, that was pretty good to see that tweet and go, wait, I thought, wait, what?
It did happen.
Nothing about this makes sense at all. I remember a Packer loss at the end. Whatever. There were enough odd things that happened at Lambeau last year as far as losses for the Packers go that maybe that whole thing was just a dream as well. It was just one of those Chantix-fueled dreams that, there is no banner. There's no spoon, there's no nothing.
Man, it sucks that ESPN has the power to take away the NFC North Championship.
I know, right? Like, who gave them the authority?
That's why everybody's leaving there.
I was gonna say, is it because of that, or is it because of did they get this ability as a result of getting the Monday night games? Like, okay, well, Sunday night's a bigger thing, but you can have Monday nights, and you'll have the ability to determine who actually won divisions 6 months after they were decided.
Oh man.
Well, if you believe that there was a strong bias against the Vikings, this has renewed your faith in that belief.
Well, that is going to be it for this week. I believe you can be followed at Vikings Corner. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
You can find his website again at MNVikingsCorner.com. That's MNVikingsCorner.com, not underlined VikingsCorner.com. That is purely a time capsule.
A fantastic one.
Fantastic time capsule. You can follow Arif at Arif Hassan NFL. You can follow myself at Big Mono. I also do the Norse Code Twitter account at NorseCodeDN. You can follow our other host, who is having all sorts of drunken fun over at Red Rocks right now. I assume it's Red Rocks. He said it's going to be very cold out, and he lives out in Denver, so I assume he's out at Red Rocks tonight. At Dusty O'Connell. If you would like to donate to the show, if you like what you've heard and hear value in what you've heard, you can donate to us either at paypal.me/NorseCode, or if you'd like to become a sustaining member to the show and have like a monthly subscription to us, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode. We really do appreciate the support you guys have given us over the years, and really appreciate any sort of help you're willing to provide to us. So thank you guys so much for listening. For Arif, for Daniel, thanks for coming on. My name is James, and our formula is this: keep Teddy alive. And we'll see you next week.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.